The U.S. Secretary of State gets a chance to talk with Novi's Paul Whelan. Does it get Whelan any closer to being released from a Russian prison? If the UAW calls a strike, the ripple effect math is troubling. And do you have a Michigan accent? Is it changing? Today is Sunday, August 20th, 2023, and this is Flashpoint. Hi, welcome to Flashpoint. We continue to be on UAW watch. Yes, the contract deadline is still weeks away, but at this point, you have to wonder if more industry watchers would be more surprised if there isn't a strike than if there is. But economists are sharpening their pencils to figure out what a strike would mean to the overall Michigan economy. And as diversified as we've become, it would still register on the Richter scale. We're going to talk about that ahead this morning. We're also going to talk about a Detroit Free Press story from last week that caught my attention, and it turns out the attention of many others too. That Michigan accent that means that salad is salad and traffic is traffic. There are people who study the way we talk, and it turns out little by little that accent is changing. We're going to have a course in linguistics a little later on. But up first, the latest on a story we have been following for way too long. That's the continued imprisonment of Novi's Paul Whelan. Whelan has been held in Russia since 2018, and he and his family just keep waiting and waiting and waiting for an indication that his release is coming. This past week, he had a long phone call with the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Does that move the needle at all? We will talk again with Paul's brother David first today on Flashpoint. Well, I am so disappointed that we have been covering the Paul Whelan story for so very long. For more than 4.5 years now, he has been held in Russia. Over the years, we've seen little wisps of hope as other Americans have been released, but there has really been one frustration after another for his family. We again turn to his brother, David Whelan, who joins us with the latest. David joining us now from San Diego today. David, we really do need to stop meeting like this.
It's a tough thing to talk about.
Yeah, I know. And now this past week, there was a phone call between Paul and the American Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. That sounded hopeful when I saw the headline, but it didn't really seem to come with a ton of promise, I guess.
That's right. The U.S. government has been extraordinary in Paul's case from the very beginning when Ambassador Huntsman went to visit him at Lefort. I think every ambassador now has, except for our Ambassador Huntsman, has been able to get out to Mordovia to visit Paul, and then to have calls like this. This is the second call from Secretary of State Blinken. It shows that the U.S. government really is making sure that he knows and that our family knows that they are doing what they can. And unfortunately, it's a status update. It's not actual information about him coming home.
But I guess that was your takeaway from what happened is that you were sort of, I guess, buoyed by the fact that really the highest level person that we can have working on this right now is still very involved in it.
Yes, I think that the message to our family and to Paul is not only to keep the faith, as the State Department said, but to see that at the very top levels of the State Department, everybody is engaged. Everybody is still focusing on how to bring Paul home. And I think that the message is also heard in the Kremlin, and whether they take note of it and do something about it or not, I don't know. But I think it is important for them to realize, too, that Paul has not fallen to the back burner. Yeah,
it's interesting the way that Secretary Blinken was talking after the conversation. It reminded me of like NFL team or any pro sports teams that try to work a three-person trade, because it doesn't appear that we have much in our prisons or jails, Russians of note, that we could trade for Paul. He's now looking among our allies to try to see if any of them have something that the Russians might be interested in making a trade. That kind of tells us a little bit about the dilemma of where the American viewpoint stands right now.
It's very tricky. I think that the best opportunity was during the Trump administration when the Russians essentially said that they would trade Paul back for 2 Russian citizens, and the U.S. government didn't go for that. And then those citizens were traded back for Trevor Reed and for Brittany Griner. And so I think that the difficulty the U.S. government has now, if you're going to get a concession for an extortionist, which is what the Kremlin is, but you've started to give away all the things that they've already asked for, then it becomes very tricky to find out what else you can give them, because they continue to arrest Americans. They arrested Evan Gershkovich this year. I'm sure that there are other Americans who will get caught up in this in the future. And unfortunately, I think the U.S. government has some hurdles to figure out how they can come up with concessions.
In fact, you and I talked, I think it was the last time we talked, was when Evan Gershkovich had been arrested and taken into custody in Russia. And I think at the time we thought, well, maybe that's a high-profile name, a Wall Street Journal reporter that can kind of shake things loose. Now I'm wondering if it's the opposite, if the impact has been that he's something now that Russia's really interested in keeping and hanging on to, and if that's really only complicated things from Paul's situation.
It probably hasn't complicated things with Paul's situation. I mean, it makes it difficult for the U.S. government, but they tend to approach each of these cases individually. I mean, it's one of the reasons that he was left behind when Trevor Reed and then Brittany Griner came home, is that there just wasn't a way to bring more than one person home at a time. Yeah. So I don't think from that perspective it's complicated, but I do have the concern for Evan Gershkovich and his family and friends that they may put him through the same process that they put Paul through, which is that they really will just wait. They don't have any reason to treat these people well. They don't treat Paul well, and they can really wait out as long as they need to. And as we saw just yesterday, an American citizen who was already in a Russian prison has been labeled or charged with espionage, right, in addition to his bribery charges. And so, they really don't have any compunction on lengthening sentences, adding charges, keeping people as long as they need to in order to get what they want.
When we just, I know I was struck when I looked at I was counting back to 2018 when he was first taken into custody and and again, realizing how long that has been now. It's only a couple of months away from being 5 years. That has got to be astonishing and awfully hard-hitting for you and the rest of the family to consider how long this odyssey has lasted now.
Very difficult. It'll be 1,700 days next week. And yeah, I mean, when children are born, you say, oh, they're 2 months old or they're 3 months old. I think we're at the stage where, children have been born and grown up and are going to kindergarten now, all in the time that Paul has been in Russian prison as a hostage. And it's a remarkably difficult thing to keep doing. Yeah.
We've talked a number of times about the impact that the war in Ukraine has had and the increasing, the bitter stance between our two nations right now. I don't imagine anything has happened there to change your thinking on whether that's been having a worse impact than it has. It's just made things very, very complicated all along, hasn't it?
It has, and I think the biggest impact has been on Paul himself in prison, which is that they now don't get enough food, they don't get enough textiles to work. So there's a huge amount of boredom, concern about being underfed and what that does to his physical health, that sort of thing. So I think that unfortunately, he is really in a point while this impasse goes on where he just continues to suffer day to day, and we just have to keep hoping that a resolution is coming.
Lastly, David, can you give me a sense of how you feel like he's doing mentally right now? This has been it really is a long slog, but then you get to talk to the Secretary of State. I suppose that might lift your spirits a little bit, but how do you feel like Paul's doing right now?
I think he's doing remarkably well. He has cracked jokes with our parents, and they've let us know that it's not all smiles coming from Paul. He's aware of how hard it is, but I think he has kept a remarkable link to his old life, to what freedom is, to the things that matter to him, and he has not yet been beaten by the Kremlin or by the prisons in Russia.
Dave, we keep you so very at the top of our thoughts, you and the family and Paul, and we, of course, continue to wish you the best, and here's to hoping we talk about better things on our next occasion to be together.
Sounds good, Devin. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Thanks. We come back, we will talk about the cost that UAW strike might have on the broader Michigan economy. This is Flashpoint on Local 4. All right, let's turn back to the increasingly worrisome standoff between the UAW and the automakers. We've watched the back and forth between Shawn Fain and particularly Stellantis, but now more voices from the outside are weighing in, particularly those worried about the broader impacts of a strike. Our Rod Maloney spent some time with economist Patrick Anderson this week, and Anderson is doing some very troubling math.
When the United Auto Workers struck General Motors 4 years ago, it cost the company roughly $2 billion. Anderson Economic Group founder Patrick Anderson today told the Automotive Press Association GM never made up that loss either. So as he crunches prospective strike loss numbers just for a short 10-day walkout against just one of the automakers, he says Ford would lose earnings to the tune of $341 million, GM $275 million, and Stellantis $244 million. Yet he believes auto dealers and their customers are likely to take an immediate and very painful hit because inventories overall are about 20% of what they were 4 years ago.
If the rhetoric goes right up to the end and you see a strike against all three, or they're threatened about that, you're going to see dealers run out of product right away. And you're going to see consumers affected. As in few new vehicles available.
The loss numbers skyrocket if the UAW strikes all three at the same time, adding up to $2.5 billion. And he warns
there's plenty of opportunities for consumers to substitute vehicles that are produced by other makers.
So I'll tell you what I'm going to do with their proposal. I'm going to file it in its proper place.
Anderson is also deeply concerned about UAW President Shawn Fain's fiery rhetoric leading to a too costly contract.
The worst thing that happens isn't a bad strike. It's a bad settlement that ends up with a contract that's not sustainable.
All right, our thanks to Rod. And let's turn now again to Dr. Jeff Reitmer, who teaches global supply chain management at Wayne State. And you and I were in contact earlier this week. Yep. And you were, this is your specialty, is understanding the ripple effects. Yep. So for every one job that we're talking about directly impacted by the strike,
about 10 and a half. And that's
down the chain.
Down the supply chain to the bars and the restaurants that are near the assembly plants.
Right.
It just goes on.
Yeah. So what you've heard so far, I think that you would fall into that camp that you'd be more surprised now if there wasn't a strike than if there is.
I think he has to, just because of what he's come out with of this is all I want. Mm-hmm. And if he doesn't deliver, then he has to go out and strike and say, okay, I've done the best I can. This is it.
So if we see a strike, thinking then about the supply chain, what do you see the impacts being and how soon?
If it's the 40-day one, like 4 years ago,
yep,
then it's just going to start hitting the lower levels, the 2s to 3s, which are small, some of them just family owned, and they won't declare bankruptcy. They'll just close their doors, liquidate.
And that'll be it.
And that'll be it. The tier ones can hang on.
And I assume that's because right now their margins are already so thin.
Oh, yeah.
40 days is all it takes to knock you out of business.
Oh yeah, and probably less.
Wow.
But then the tier ones, they can roll with it for a while, because if you look at the total supply chain and you look at the Detroit 3, probably 80% of those suppliers serve one or more. So, and then throughout the supply chain, the transplants.
Yeah.
So they're going to be okay for a while.
To Patrick Anderson's point that we just heard there are things worse than a strike, like if you get a bad deal. You pointed out to me this past week that, the old joke, I don't even want to call it a joke because there was too much truth in it, was that the automakers were basically in the business of building cars so that they could provide health care to their employees and their retirees.
That's why they're not going to go back to taking retiree medical on. It's been proven they can't survive. That was 2007, 2008. And then they're not going to give everybody a pension.
Now, if we compare it to what happened 2007, 2008, we are not in near the economic straits that we were then.
Correct.
But where we are now is interest rates have jumped so high. We just saw mortgages this past week, highest in 21 years. Same's going to happen with car loans. And if you're a company, same thing of borrowing money and trying to...
You're going to try to borrow money to keep continuing operations going. And if you're a small company, you're not going to be able to do it. Because the bank's just going to look at you and say, well, you know what, your assets aren't worth anything. And then that just perpetuates it. And The tier ones are okay because they can go and they can get financing from a lot of different sources.
How much of Sean Fain's argument, though, do you think really does hold water? I mean, when he talks about the big three waving around the profit margins that they have, especially Stellantis, the most profitable car maker in the world, does he have a point?
He has a point. I don't agree with it, but he has a point. But I think he's negotiating like it's 1953 and it's 2023. And they're two different eras, they're two different periods. And you're seeing this change over to electric. And right now, all the tax cuts and all the tax breaks are there. But what happens when they're not? Is there a market? And you need less people to make an electric car. So that's a threat to the union.
Less people, but as he points out, better trained people. I mean, it takes maybe, for some of these jobs, it's 2 years of training before you can start handling the battery work on the line.
And I could see the job bank coming back as not a job bank, as of training. And that, okay, we don't have work for you, but you're going to go here and we're going to train you how to do the next generation of cars.
Is the 32-hour work week a non-starter, or is...
Yeah. My wife said we're not France. So it's not going to happen.
We've noticed. We don't quite have the vacation plan or the healthcare system either, we would point out. Jeff, really good to have you on again. I really appreciate your expertise. You bet. We come back, we will talk about the Michigan accent. What is happening to it? This is Flashpoint on Local 4. This morning, I really wanted to tackle a topic that showed up in the Detroit Free Press this past Thursday. Kylie Martin wrote a piece about whether the Michigan accent is changing. It wasn't just about the Michigan accent, it was also about those who are charged with collecting and studying accents, not just here in Michigan, but elsewhere. I'm very happy to have with us Dr. Betsy Sneller, Associate Professor of Linguistics at Michigan State University. Dr. Sneller, I really appreciate your time on this. Thanks so much.
Happy to be joining you.
Before we get into what's happening with the Michigan accent and your work, I want to start with a question that I'm always curious about. Do people who have an accent recognize themselves as someone with an accent?
This is a great question, and the best way to answer it is to have everybody who's listening think to themselves, do I have an accent, yes or no? If you answered no, you're wrong. It is not possible to speak without having an accent. The question is whether your accent gets commented on or noticed as a sort of regional or different variation.
Well, then, once we start talking then about the Michigan accent, or perhaps I should say accent, tell me a little bit about what you see as the real signifiers behind the way that we talk here in the Mitten.
That was a very beautiful example of one of what for many years has been the core feature of Michigan English. There's a particular vowel shift. A bunch of different vowel pronunciations have a unique way of sounding Michigan. So in the word dad, Michiganders historically would say dad. In the word
almost
mom,
dead. Yeah, wow.
Yeah. In the word mom, Michiganders would historically say mom. And there's a couple other vowels that are included in this. Now, what we're finding in our recent research is that for younger generations, especially millennials and Gen Z, that canonical way to sound Michigan has been reversing. It's been changing. So there are other things that sound Michigan, but those two really key features are no longer the biggest signifiers of how to sound Michigan.
Wow. Well, let's also make a distinction here between accent and sort of vocabulary, right? And the way that we pop instead of soft drink or something like that, or Coke even. Right? We have to make a distinction between the way we talk versus how we, or what we call things, for example.
Yeah. So linguists typically think of dialects as having three levels. One is the vocabulary items that you use. So this is like Michiganders saying pop instead of soda.
Yep.
Vocabulary items are really easy to adopt later in life or change. The second is pronunciation. That is much harder to change once you're an adult. And the third is grammar. So the way that words are ordered in a sentence. And that's also really hard to change once you're an adult.
Yeah. So I want to talk about why you think changes are happening, because on one level, I think, of course, we're all going to start speaking to the more that we are saturated with influence, social media, videos from all over, songs, radio traffic from all over the world. Of course, that's going to change that. But then I also think, wait a minute, though, we've already decided that most people with an accent don't even think they have one. So tell me a little bit about why and how you believe the Michigan accent is undergoing changes right now, and will it stay?
And in fact, famously, within linguistics, Michiganders have historically not thought of ourselves as having an accent.
Right.
So that's very recently changing. This is actually a big mystery. Within the field of linguistics, there's been a few major media shifts that have caused us to think, oh, wow, regional dialects are going to go away. So the first was radio in the early 20th century. When everybody got a radio in their living room, linguists thought, okay, regional dialects might go away because now people are hearing a sort of standardized American English regularly. Didn't happen. And in fact, regional dialects continued to diverge from each other. And then when TV became a common household item in the 50s, linguists thought the same thing. And it still didn't happen. Regional dialects continued to diverge. And then internet is the latest thing that has caused lots of folks to think, oh, wow, regional dialects are going to go away. And what we're finding is not really, although there is an impact of the internet, which is that vocabulary items move between dialect groups a lot faster.
Yeah. So they evolve and shift, but they don't disappear, which I think some people will find will take some comfort in. Tell me a little bit. What the other thing that this terrific piece by Kylie Martin showed us is your project that you've been working on really since the pandemic, called Michigan Diaries, which is sort of this collectivist effort to which. And by the way, you're still looking for more participants, but talk about Michigan Diaries.
Yeah, so Michigan Diaries is our big research project. Anybody who's living in Michigan is an eligible participant. So if you're interested at all, please check us out. We would love to have you contribute your voices to our project. People tell us their daily lives, and as part of that, we get to hear how their language is changing over their lifetime, and how how somebody in Charlevoix might sound a little different from somebody in Chelsea, for instance.
I love it. We are going to put a link for those on our website at clickondetroit.com for those who want to link to this project that you're doing and become a part of it, because it's an ongoing. I don't even think you see a sunset on this, right? You want it to continue.
No, yeah, and we are continually looking for more funding opportunities. So our hope is to keep this project running, ideally for the next 50 years. Like, we really want to see how language changes in real time for people who are participating.
Well, people who are into words and dialects and accents like me will find this just a wonderful thing to be a part of. Dr. Snelling, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you talking about it, and I hope we'll talk about it more soon.
My pleasure.
You bet. That's going to do it for Flashpoint this morning. Thanks so much for being here. Meet the Press coming up next. Have a great week. We'll see you next time for Flashpoint.